Wichita Liberty TV, featuring host Bob Weeks. Local politics without the spin. Interviews with nationally respected economists. Hear directly from Kansas conservatives about what matters to you. It's individual liberty, limited government, and free markets. Wichita Liberty TV.
Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Kansas and Wichita government and public affairs. Broadcast Sunday mornings on channel 26.1 KGPT and repeated again in the afternoon at 4:30 p.m. Also at wichitaliberty.org, that's my site on the internet. You'll find all the old episodes of Wichita Liberty TV there and all the other material that myself and others produce almost every day. Well, today our guest is United States Representative Ron Estes, who represents the 4th District of Kansas. That's the Wichita metropolitan area, plus some counties further to the east and the west. Ron had a career in the private sector, then became treasurer of Sedgwick County. In 2010, elected treasurer of the state of Kansas. In January, Ron was selected the Republican Party nominee over a field of other candidates as Mike Pompeo resigned. That was in February, I think it was. And then the special election was on April 11th, where Ron prevailed over the Democratic Party and Libertarian Party candidates, sworn into office on April 25th, just 3 months ago. So, Ron Estes, welcome to Wichita Liberty TV, and of course, co-host Karl Peterjohn here as well. So, Representative Estes, just to get a little bit of raw politics out of the way, James Thompson, the Democratic nominee that you ran against in April, he's already said he'll be a candidate again for that office next year. What about yourself? Have you looked that far ahead yet?
My plan is to run again.
Okay.
We're trying to do right now, focus on doing the right thing while we're serving the people of the 4th District. So our focus is making sure that we run the office well, get it set up, provide good constituent services, and do the things that we're supposed to do as a representative for the 4th District.
Okay. Now, during that campaign, there were, a lot of people. Some people, maybe almost everybody in Kansas, is not happy with the tax policy that was passed under Kansas Brownback. Whether there's merit to that or not, that was a criticism of you during the campaign as in your role as State of Kansas Treasurer, that you were responsible for implementing the governor's, what they said was bad tax policy. So what was your role as the Kansas Treasurer, and was that criticism correct, I think?
Well, I think that what came out during the campaign was kind of a lack of understanding of how Kansas government works. The governor and the legislature are responsible for implementing laws and passing those laws and making sure they operate. The treasurer has a separate set of laws that dictate what the role of that office is. None of them really dictate or drive tax policy or even tax collection even. The Department of Revenue does all the tax collection for the state, whether it's income tax or sales tax. And then our role as the state treasurer was to make sure that once that money was collected, was deposited in the right bank accounts, was credited to the right agency accounts so that it was available for people to spend, as they needed for their appropriate budgets.
And I think the appropriate thing is spent as appropriated by the legislature in laws that were then assigned by the governor. So,
right.
Okay. Another question I had was, there's a lot of turmoil going on in the White House, people being fired, lots of turmoil, leaks and everything like that. That consumes a lot of attention on television and amongst people who follow politics, but does all of that have much of an impact on what really happens in the legislative process in the House of Representatives?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because really we're not letting ourselves be distracted by what's on the news. And, for the last several months there have been all sorts of stories about the Russians and about how that's going to impact things, and whether the president's going to be impeached because of the testimony of James Comey, or when that wasn't there, then the testimony of Attorney General Sessions, and so that's really not affecting us in the House in particular. We're focusing on how do we continue to make government more efficient, looking at for example, when I go around, I ask people how many people knew that the FBI Director Comey testified. And then also ask how many people knew on the same day that we repealed Dodd-Frank on the House. And it's amazing that news is not getting out through the media. So we're keeping our head down. We're focusing on making things more efficient, making sure that we fund VA choice so they take care of veterans, making sure that we address some of those bad regulations that were implemented over the last 8 to 10 years.
Well, can you talk for a minute, Congressman, about the VA situation? Because that had been a really big issue, and I thought it would get a lot more attention than it did in the past. I believe not only legislation has passed the House, but also the Senate, and I think the President signed it. Can you talk, and will that make an impact for the veterans out there?
Yeah, let's talk about it in two general areas. One, just general care of our veterans, and that's been brought up over and over again over the last multiple years, that it's been poorly done, that in a lot of cases veterans haven't received the care they need. They've been put on waiting lists. I mean, it kind of just reflects the bad example of a single payer health system. Which is a good reflection. I mean, that's the one single-payer health system that the United States has, and it shows how poorly run it is. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody in the VA system is bad. I mean, there's a lot of good folks that work in the VA, particularly here in Wichita and the hospital here. But in general, we want to make sure that our veterans get the right care that they need. One of the things that the VA Choice program does is it allows veterans to get care at facilities that aren't necessarily a VA hospital. You know, for example, if you live out in Hayes or live out in western Kansas, and you need to have a checkup for surgery, you need to have a checkup for some issue that you've had, instead of having to drive 3 or 4 hours into Wichita to attend the hospital here, VA Choice gives them the opportunity to do some things out in their local community, which one helps local providers, but it also makes sure that the best quality of life is available for the veterans.
Yeah, and certainly saves time in getting your health care. So let's take a commercial break here, and when we come back, I want to ask Representative Ron Estes another question about the future of health care. Well, welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with co-host Karl, Peterjohn, special guest United States Representative Ron Estes of Wichita. So you mentioned that problems in the VA healthcare system stemming from the fact that it's a single payer system, and that's really should be a lesson we should learn. Another single payer system run by the government, I think, is American Indian healthcare, which I don't think is anything that people are proud about either. But there's been some action involving healthcare, Obamacare, in the House of Representatives, where you serve. A bill was passed but failed to pass the United States Senate. So what do you think is going to happen with the future of health care?
Yeah, and that's really unfortunate. You know, for 7 years or longer, a lot of people in the country, including a lot of Republicans, have talked about the issues with Obamacare and how it was going to fail, and because it just wasn't structured right. And now we're seeing that failure happening when more and more insurance companies are pulling out of markets. We saw yesterday that Anthem's pulling out of several of the markets in California. In addition to, next year, 30% of the Kansans in the Kansas City area won't be able to get insurance through Obamacare. So Obamacare is failing, and we've got to do something. We can't stand for the status quo. And so, as we worked through the House, and part of it was before I was elected, part of it was once I get in office, was looking at some of those options that we can put in place to help replace Obamacare and make sure that we have health care that works for individuals. Unfortunately, the Senate couldn't come to an agreement on the health care reform package, which particularly is bad. One of the things that was one of the opportunities that was brought up was a pure repeal, and there were six Republican senators who had voted to repeal 2 years ago, but did not vote to repeal it this time when we had a Republican president. So that's kind of disappointing in general that happened. I don't know exactly what the Senate's plans are right now, but doing nothing's not an option. We can't let Obamacare stand as it is because it's failing of its own weight.
And it is kind of disappointing as a Republican that, as Mike Pompeo would say when he sat in that chair, we voted to repeal Obamacare 50 times, but now that vote really means something, we couldn't get enough Republicans on board. Karl, you had a...
The question I would throw out is there's been talk that Congress would move on to maybe tax reform or other issues. There's an awful lot out there. But there's also talk, the president said that he's going to eliminate the funding that had been provided to the insurance companies and putting members of Congress, basically eliminating the program that they've had in place. The idea that Congress is getting something special, how do you feel about that?
I completely support you with the president making those comments. One, the support for Obamacare right now exists because we are providing a bailout for insurance companies. I mean, it's couched by using terms like stabilization and cost sharing, but really it's just a bailout for the insurance companies to support Obamacare. The other piece of that discussion was one of the executive orders from President Obama was allowed congressional members to keep their insurance payments by the federal government. I, for one, think that we in the government ought to live under the same rules as that we put in place for other citizens, and making sure that we have to follow those same rules, whether they deal with health care, whether they deal with OSHA, whether they deal with employment issues. We should follow those same rules, because if they're burdensome for American citizens, or too burdensome for us to use, then they're probably too burdensome for American citizens as well.
And that does seem to be a problem. I know, like the Obama administration said we must pay women the equal as men, but then people look at the salaries and find out that the salary gap exists in the White House just like it does everywhere else, for better or worse. But Congressman Estes, we talked about Russia just briefly earlier, as being the source of a lot of turmoil and so forth. What should our policy goals be with regard to Russia, do you think?
Well, let's break that into two separate things. One thing that's been talking about the most is interference in the election, which, you know, there's not been any evidence of tampering with ballot boxes. I mean, make sure that that's true and out there. However, there's lots of issues around cybersecurity and attempts at hacking from the Russians or from the other Eastern Europeans or the Chinese, and so that's an issue that we have as a country that we have to face and make sure that we deal with. The other piece in general, about our relationship with the Russians. I mean, obviously we're a powerful nation. They are as well. And I think Secretary Tillerson probably had a good comment around that when he says that, you know, sometimes we can be adversaries and sometimes we can partner on things that seem to make sense to work together on. But we need to make sure that our goals aren't always aligned. Sometimes they are, sometimes they should be. But we need to be reflective of when they are and when they aren't, and how do we act accordingly.
You know, we do have to remember that Russia, the former Soviet Union, is a big nuclear power. We worry about North Korea getting even one bomb or one missile, but Russia has what, Karl, hundreds or thousands?
A couple thousands.
And, I would think keeping those in their silos where they belong is probably a good goal for all of us. So let's take another moment off for a commercial break. We'll be back with more Wichita Liberty TV in just a moment. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with our special guest, Congressman Ron Estes, and co-host Karl Peterjohn. Karl, you had a question, I believe.
Yes, Congressman, we've had a long history with Washington of not passing regular order budgets. We've got a debt ceiling vote that's pending. Is anything going to be different this year than what's happened in the recent past?
Well, I'm a strong advocate that we need to be passing all 12 budget resolutions. We need to be all 12 appropriations and making sure that we have a budget as well. I don't think we need to get into the process of having continuing resolutions and omnibus bills that are bloated with all sorts of spending in order to get the votes.
So if I could just butt in, continuing resolution, or CR they say, is when Congress can't come to an agreement on a budget by the deadline, so they just vote to continue spending as we have been. And if I'm thinking right, also omnibus bills are just these big, huge bills, like you said, where you can't really tell whether the people voted for it because they wanted this or that. There's so much in there, it's just It's everything.
That's right. I mean, our normal process for government should be is that we authorize 12 different spending bills. You know, one for defense and one for health and welfare, one for energy and water, and so each different categories.
So more manageable chunks.
Manageable size. It allows us to look at them, analyze them, make sense, and vote for or against amendments that make sense or don't make sense.
Well, let's make the rubber hit the road here a little bit, because the House has a responsibility. The Senate's also got a responsibility. There are 12. How many of the House passed of these 12 budget bills, and how many have the Senate passed, and if any of them gone to conference?
Yeah. Let me back up a little bit and add a little bit of history to that. For the last 10 years, they haven't been all 12 passed at all. And this year, the first year of a president's term is always a little bit delayed in that process, because the president doesn't come into office until January, so he doesn't get his budget done. So we have passed 4. Right before we left, we passed a consolidated appropriations for 4 of those appropriations. We spoke with the Speaker Friday before we left, and he said, when we come back, we're going to pass all 12. Now, unfortunately, when we come back, we'll be into Washington. We'll be in September.
And so the end of the start of the fiscal year,
the start of the last month. The start of the last month of the fiscal year.
So you'll have about 3 weeks or so.
So realistically, it's probably going to be a continuing resolution this year, but because I don't think that the House and the Senate will be able to reconcile all of that to get back to a final budget done. But the Speaker knows that the will of the members of the House is we want to get back to regular order. We actually talked about that the last 2 months of how do we make that happen. So I don't think we're going to get to the point that we have, even as recently as 2017, in terms of having a big bloated omnibus bill that has all this excess spending in it. But I don't think we're going to be as successful this year in getting all 12 bills done on time. But that's what we're going to work on next year.
And I think I remember the Speaker, Paul Ryan, when he came into office, that he thought that was very important to return to. And Karl, you had mentioned something earlier about the debt limit that's got to be addressed pretty soon.
Which is going to be coming up first, the debt limit or the budget bills?
The budget bills will come up first as soon as we get back. In fact, we may have we're in some phone calls and conversations during the month of August when we're all back in the district. So we may, the first week we're back, pass a budget, and then start to work. It may be the first or second week before we pass a 12 appropriations bill, and then the vote on the debt ceiling will come up after that, probably before the end of September.
Well, I know the Secretary of the Treasury has been quoted and talked about how this is absolutely crucial going forward. Can you talk a little bit, because this is one big difference between, say, state and local government, where you've had a lot of experience, and the federal government, because we couldn't do what the feds do when I was on the county commission and when you were county, and as well as state treasurer. And I think the debt limit is not very well understood, especially in light of the latest trustees reports on Social Security and Medicare funding.
Yep. I mean, the federal government does not do what 49 of the 50 states are required to do, and balance its own budget. And that's the whole crux of the problem.
Who's the one state that doesn't have
Vermont. Vermont doesn't have that in their constitution, that they have to have a
Is that why
budget.
Bernie Sanders moved there?
I guess maybe that's why he was so popular there.
Well, I don't know. When we talk single payer, we're talking socialism, and then Socialist People's Republic of Vermont.
Which blows up a lot of spending when you do that. Our real root cause is that we're spending more money than we're bringing in. And at the end of the day, you end up adding more debt and adding more debt in order to pay those bills. There's all sorts of negative consequences tied to that, from the standpoint of, one, you're either borrowing money, which means you have to pay it back and pay it back with interest, or two, the only way you get out of it is to inflate your currency, which then makes all of the dollars that we have today that we've earned worth less.
So savers really get
punished,
stuck,
horribly punished. And so we've got to get out of that. And when I look back and look at, during the 8 years that President Bush was in office, we doubled the debt from just under $5 trillion to just under $10 trillion. During 8 years that President Obama was in office, we doubled the debt again from just under $10 trillion to just under $20 trillion. And so, now when I look at what we would be passing on to our kids and grandkids from that standpoint, it's not the right thing to do. I mean, we need to stop that. We need to fix it. We need to turn the ship around, because basically we're borrowing money in order to fund our current lifestyles, and we need to change that.
Exactly right. Well, let's take our last commercial break on Wichita Liberty TV today. We'll be back in just a moment. Well, welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, co-host Karl Peterjohn, and our guest, United States Congressman Ron Estes. So, I'm not sure, but I think that the federal deficit this year is going to be a little bit bigger than the year before, and now we have Republicans in charge of everything, and I'm kind of concerned also that Donald Trump ran on the platform that he's not going to touch entitlements such as Social Security and Medicare, and those are really big driving forces in government spending. So without that attitude from the White House, do you think there's much choice of not paying back the debt? I mean, if we could just get to zero on the deficit, that would be a huge accomplishment.
It would be a huge accomplishment. And you're right, in 2017, we're going to spend more money in 2016 budget years. And I voted against that omnibus that was there the second week that I was in office because it increased our spending by over $100 billion over 2016. And it was amazing to see that there were more Democrat votes for that than there were Republican votes for that what I call bloated omnibus bill for 2017. So it was one of those things that I think the president agreed to do in order to keep the process moving forward and get some things accomplished. He's come back with a very reduced budget for 2018, and his proposal to do that just to help cut some of that spending, and that's part of what we're working on the House side is to address that. There's also some issues with pent up cuts that affect military, and so I think there will be some spending increases on the military to make sure that we replace some of those cuts that happened under the Obama years, and make sure that our fighting forces have the weapons and the tools as well as the training to execute what they need to do. But I'm a big advocate that we need to make sure that we're ultimately going to have to get to where we balance the budget, and I'm going to be supportive of that. I'd be supportive of a balanced budget amendment. If that's the one thing that I'm known for in office, I'd be proud of that.
It's so difficult to reform spending. We saw that in Kansas over the past several years. But your predecessor, Mike Pompeo, for several years, he introduced bills, he wrote editorials against a federal agency called the EDA, not EPA, but the Economic Development Administration. Relatively small agency. Its budget was $400 or $500 million, which in Washington terms is, peanuts. But when Mike Pompeo spoke out against that, they sent out the secretary here. He appeared with the governor at Learjet and said, look at all this stuff EDA is doing. So the Donald Trump budget, I think, called for the elimination of EDA and some other agencies too. Do you think it's likely that any of that will happen?
I think there'll be some reductions. I don't know if all of that. Government programs are one of the things that are almost everlasting life because you can't end them.
Why, especially like with healthcare, with Obamacare, once we give something to people, it's very difficult to take it away.
That's right. You just can't stop that. And I'm a bigger advocate of let's end programs, particularly ones that may have started 20 years ago that may or may not have had a good purpose then, but now aren't as effective. And so let's look at cutting out whole programs. If we fall short of that, we couldn't even pass a 1% cut in entitlements or in discretionary spending on the House floor. Just an across-the-board 1% cut.
Doesn't Marsha Blackburn offer that every year?
And she did it again this year, and I voted for it, and it still didn't get enough votes to pass.
Wow.
Did it come close?
It came closer, but it still wasn't close enough. Yeah.
And 1%, it seems like almost nothing, but just can't get it done, can we?
That's right, and that's unfortunate that we are voted on to represent our district, but at the end of the day, we've got to support how do we keep America strong, and talking about what's our greatest defense risk is been talked about as being our debt and what we owe.
Well, even worse than North Korea, Iran, Islamic extremism that could result in another September 11th type event. I mean, is the financial challenge that much bigger, do you think, than what we're facing overseas?
Well, there's two parts to that. One is over time you end up not being able to afford either the social services or the defense to defend yourself. And then two, and you can borrow money and borrow money and borrow money until people stop lending to you. And when you stop lending to you, you really are in trouble at that point in time.
Right.
Look at the situation in Puerto Rico. Look to some degree in Greece, although we're probably have more relevant information around Puerto Rico just because it's closer to us and more appropriate. You can look back at whole nations like Brazil and Argentina back in the 70s and 80s and the issues that affected them. And they really then have to get into drastic cuts because people are no longer willing to loan you money in order to spend for your lifestyle.
Yeah, and that's when people really don't like it. And I worry too about intergenerational warfare, where old guys like us are going to be drawing Social Security, but young people, when they start to see that tax going up and up, that they may not want to pay for that. So, well, there's a lot we could talk about, but we are out of time for today. So, Karl, thank you for your co-hosting duties, and Representative Ron Estes, thank you very much for your time today. That's it for another episode of Wichita Liberty TV. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.